Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward, and sadly, you just get me for now. Drea is, of course, busy doing her various psychology things, of which I am not qualified to talk. So, but we didn't want you to go another week without an episode. It was very important to us to get an episode up this week. So we decided that we were going to put up our San Diego Comic-Con 2017 panel. We couldn't be more excited to present this panel to you guys and girls, Gothamites of all ages. It was a great opportunity for us, and one that we will never forget. It was an opportunity to speak with two people with whom we have wanted to talk about Batman the Animated Series for as long as we've been doing the show. And in fact, if you notice, we've not done too many interviews because, frankly, there are only a few people really worth talking about, and those are the people who are the most essential to the success of Batman the Animated Series. And we were fortunate enough to have two of those people on the show during San Diego Comic-Con. So with that being said, here is our 2017 San Diego Comic-Con panel. The Arkham Sessions presents The Psychology of Batman the Animated Series with Dr. Andrea Letamendi, myself, our good friend, DC writer Brenden Fletcher, and of course, our very special guests, Paul Dini and Alan Burnett. Now you'll notice Brenden is a few minutes late to the panel. He'll get his own introduction a little bit into it, but this panel's a lot of fun. So here it is. Until next week, enjoy. We're just waiting on one more panelist, but you know what? We've sort of learned in the past years that we often want the extra time, so we're going to take some extra time if you guys don't mind. We're going to go ahead and get started a little early. Great. And when Brenden gets here, we'll just give him a huge round of applause and get started. For starters, God, look at it's a packed house. It's Saturday night, 7 p.m.-ish, at Comic-Con. God, you guys could be doing anything, but you're here to talk about the psychology of Batman the Animated Series, 25 years celebrating. That shows us one thing. We nerds know how to party. Yep. It's going to be awesome. We're going to dive into the psychology of stuff, but we're also going to learn a lot about how these gentlemen work, which is going to be pretty fantastic. For starters, has anyone here heard of the Arkham Sessions? We got a few people. But your question is, has anyone listened to the Arkham Sessions? This is going to be like an hour-long infomercial, so it's going to be awesome. My name is Brian Ward, and I have the great privilege of co-hosting a podcast called... Yes, you're right. Called The Arkham Sessions. It is a podcast dedicated to analyzing every single episode of Batman the Animated Series through the critical lens of a clinical psychologist. Yeah, and we have with us that clinical psychologist, thank God, because it would be really awkward if we didn't. She is the curator of UnderTheMaskOnline.com, where she writes about all of your favorite geeky heroes and villains and what makes them tick. She is also a consultant for writers of film, television, books, comics. It's a gig that landed her written into canon in Gail Simone's run of Batgirl as Barbara Gordon's therapist. Everyone, please welcome my co-host, Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Yeah.
Hi, Brian.
Thanks for joining us. I appreciate you taking the invitation and accepting. These two gentlemen absolutely
do not need an introduction, but they absolutely deserve one, and a great one. I wish I could give that, but I'm going to do my best. They are two of the most seminal people in the success of Batman the Animated Series. Emmy-winning, both, Mr. Alan Burnett, Mr. Paul Dini. I can't even begin to tell you how honored we are to have them. When we first started this podcast a couple years ago, we were just talking about this outside. We actually hoped that gentlemen like these didn't hear it, because we were like, please don't tell us to stop. All we want to do is talk about geek stuff, Batman specifically. But also because Drea is so good at her job, she can't watch anything without going like, oh, I'm seeing a lot of trauma, I'm seeing a lot of PTSD, and it's pretty awesome. I actually want to ask you guys, you guys both are big fans of animation in general, not just Batman. Paul, I've seen some of your collection of your cells. You not only know what it came from, but you know who animated that. You know the story about each individual frame. I'm wondering why animation for the two of you? What is it about that medium that gives you the opportunity to do something that maybe other mediums don't?
Well, for me, it wasn't that planned. I'm here because I read comic books like a wild nut when I was between 9 and 14. I had the chance of going back at the start of the series, go back to DC and get in their libraries and go through all the Batman comics and all the detective comics from 1955 to the present at that time, which was 1991. And I could see, here's where I started, and here's where I sort of ended and started reading Goldfinger and spy books and stuff like that. But I always picked up copies of Batman every once in a while because I was just a great fan. And those 4 years of reading comic books, it was my life. I mean, I used to reread. This is going to sound bizarre, but I was a kid. I used to make up my own hero and reread the comic panels and make up my own stories. I made lists of the stories of my character, and some of that has bled into Batman too. But those 4 years mean more than any. I have a master's in film production. It means more than that to the success of my career. And I didn't necessarily think I was getting an animation. I was a big Hitchcock fan. I liked suspense. And I, make a long story short, I was a page at NBC, got an internship in children's programs. I was actually giving notes at the age of 27 on Jack Kirby boards for Fantastic Force, the Saturday morning show. Wow. And it was like, oh, be careful here. And then later on, the women who were my bosses at NBC took over Hanna-Barbera and took over Warner Brothers, and I followed along. And I was lucky enough that they gave me Super Friends, and they knew I was a big superhero fan, and that's how it started. That's my story.
I guess I gravitated to animation the same way another child would gravitate toward theater or playing the guitar or football or something like that. The minute I saw cartoons, I was entranced by them. I loved them. I loved animation. I loved going to see animated movies. I loved learning about them, and that came part and parcel with a love for comic strips. When I was a kid, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my parents subscribed to a total of like 3 daily papers. Back then, they had daily. They did 2 daily papers for the San Francisco for San Francisco, and there was one for Oakland. and we subscribed to 2 of them, and my dad would bring home one from the city. So on most days, I had 3 comic pages to read, and an incredible wealth of everything that was published from the late 60s to around 1980. And I just devoured it all. And that was matched with a love for cartoons, and primarily, feature animation, classic Warner Brothers. I would watch Saturday morning cartoons, but they didn't have the snap of the fully animated stuff, but I really gravitated toward that. And around the time I went to college, I found myself rooming with a lot of people who liked science fiction, fantasy, and who actually worked in a comic book store in Boston. So I would read all the books that they brought home every week on New Comic Book Day, and that's when I really developed a love for Frank Miller, Neil Adams, Jack Kirby, and guys like that.
We have our 4th panelist. Everyone, this gentleman.
Has a bag of stuff.
Absolutely, no, it's all right. When we started the podcast, suddenly I got a tweet from the gentleman who wrote Batgirl at the time, talking about his love of Batman the Animated Series and his enjoyment of our show, and I got giddy over it, and ever since we've become good friends and always end up just talking about Batman the Animated Series at some point in time. So when we decided to do this panel, we absolutely knew that Brenden had to be a part of it. He's written for Batgirl, one of my favorites, Gotham Academy, and right now he's killing it over at Motor Crush. Everyone welcome Brenden Fletcher.
I'm here to bookend Alan and Paul with fandom.
Well, I'm curious, Brenden, because we've spoken at times about how this series and series like it, but specifically Batman, influenced your writing now for DC Comics and just comics in general.
I don't think that I had ever... I was a young man, and I hadn't given the villains the consideration that maybe they were due until... episodes of the animated series like Heart of Ice, of course, which, we all know completely redefined who Mr. Freeze is and what he can be as a character in the Batman mythology. Is this too much? Am I gushing too much? Okay. But I think that was a big deal for me, and you can, if you go and look at the stuff that I've done at DC with my friends, we all kind of feel the same way, and we have, I believe, a greater sympathy with the villains. We think of them as people, broken people, who have pain that they're dealing with, and in fact, the Gotham Academy series is all about the pain that a young woman suffers when her mother was looked at as one of those villains.
It's amazing, and it's an amazing story.
Oh, thanks.
Drea, tell us about your love of Batman the Animated Series and specifically why we chose this show in order to get the psychological science out.
I'm going to try to speak clearly and like a normal human being about the animated series with Paul and Alan here. I think Paul has heard me talk about this before, but truly the animated series was my gateway into Batman anything, like Batman comics, Batman fandom, Batman, t-shirts, everything. And can I get an applause for people who is the same way, like the animated series was their entry? Yeah. So I was this kid who was really nerdy, already kind of into comic strips actually, but not really into Batman. And I started watching the animated series and I was completely just immersed in the storytelling. And I was too young to really get it at the time, but these are stories about redemption and recovery and such serious topics that now as a psychologist, I totally get it and I totally see how many lessons are learned in these narratives about empathy. about emotional intelligence, about second chances, about the complexity of good and bad, right and wrong, villain and hero. In fact, I think that the world is sort of like that. We're not black and white. We're not just, you're good or you're bad. We're really built and we develop based on our history, based on what happens to us. And as a psychologist, much of my work has been in trauma recovery, in anxiety disorders, in depression, and some actually very serious things. And so I sort of came full circle when I got my degree and when I started to kind of intersect comics and psychology. I went back to the animated series as a way for me to use that storytelling to educate others and to have something that's accessible and something that people relate to in order to enhance and increase mental health literacy. So to get completely personal here, I don't know that I would be a psychologist doing what I'm doing if it weren't for the animated series and it weren't for the work that these two have done. For real, 100% for real.
Speaking for both of us, I'd say we're honored that the work meant that much to you. Every once in a while, I'm lucky enough to hear from somebody who credits the show with a pivotal moment or a change in their life, and I chalk that most up to the strength of their own personality and their own inquisitive nature or their own determination, and that maybe Batman is something along the way. I heard from several people who've become police officers because they can't be Batman, but they can do some good by taking what they've learned from Batman and other heroes and trying to bring those better qualities out into everyday life to help other people.
Absolutely. I mean, Drea's done panels before that have basically shown superheroes in real life, where she'll show a panel or a slide on a screen, and she'll say it'll be Batman swinging through the city and explosions around him, and she's like, how many people think this is just fiction? And everyone raises their hands. And then she'll show like an IED going off in Afghanistan and everyone running toward it and picking up comrades and doing this, and she's just like, those guys are Batman. Like this happens in real life. People who run toward the explosions instead of away. And one thing I have to ask, because it is a very serious topic to some degree, is that you could have easily just created a show that was just punch 'em up, simple action adventure, and I don't want to say the work would have been easier or harder, but it could have been a simple show and you guys decided to go complex. Could you talk about the development of why you chose this tone?
The other way is boring. And it's been done for decades.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that just grates me, it's when I see superhero shows, whatever they are, where it's good against evil. It just drives me nuts. And if you start going into their personalities, you get away from all that. You start getting into nitty-gritty stuff, and everything becomes more interesting. So I think that was our sense from the beginning. I mean, nobody came out and said we're going to do psychological stories, but that's what we wanted to do. It just seemed like we had an opportunity here to do that and to make a show that wasn't a Saturday morning show, but an afternoon show.
Well, the real, Jean McCurdy really should be up here taking some bows for this, because she really wanted people who felt an affinity for Batman and stories and characters like that to work on the show. But she always encouraged us to do our best. Whenever to think to think beyond what had been done, to really craft stories out of our imaginations and our passions, and basically just like I said, do your best, do what gets you excited, and that's where something wonderful will come out. If it was Batman, if it was Animaniacs or Freakazoid or whatever, and she really knew how to cast a show with the people who had the passion for it.
It's amazing to me. We've done 105 episodes of the podcast, and I don't think Drea's touched on a single topic more than once in terms of, we go through in production order. Because for us, it's very important to go in order because you get to see the arcs of these characters. You get to see the first time the Joker whoever hit the screen in Christmas with the Joker, and you get to see the last time, and Drea gets to determine whether he's made any progress. He's been in Arkham a lot. Has he, Drea?
At this point, no.
He's no longer. He's not writing Christmas trees out of Arkham.
There's
Asylum
that.
anymore.
There's that.
Yeah.
He hasn't done that again.
Yes. But there are so many amazing topics that you've pulled from this, and you certainly have a list of favorites that you like to go to. Like, what kind of serious topics have you been able to glean from Batman?
Well, Brenden mentioned Heart of Ice, and certainly that's one of the stories that has so much depth to it psychologically, and really, I think, is really one of the first, sort of Batman stories that allows us to understand how trauma can shape us and how trauma can essentially create our paths for us. And so that's an example of where we'll take that story, and then what we do on the show is that we go through the episode and we talk about the characters and kind of where they've been, but we then lift up the psychological science and talk more seriously about, so what does it mean to have experienced a traumatic loss, or what does it mean to be in this, in this relationship that's just, wrought with intimate partner violence. So Harley and the Joker, for instance. What about things like stalking? We've covered the Mad Hatter. We've covered Firefly in this most recent episode, where stalking behavior was pretty serious. And so we'll start with the characters, and then we'll talk more about the realistic themes that have to do with real life psychology. And it sounds kind of, I don't know how it sounds, but honestly, it's easy. With this show, it's really easy, where there's no story that's just like, oh, they're just punching each other, that's it. Every single story, especially the ones that you two are involved in, have a complexity to it that's often very dark, to be honest, but also that allows us to see these villains and these characters through Batman's perspective, and then in turn allows us to see Batman through the counterparts. So when we're talking about Mr. Freeze's trauma, inevitably we're going to talk about what's going on with Batman. So has he then recovered from his trauma? How is he identifying himself based on his experience with loss? When we covered Baby Doll, which is such a fascinating character, just her identity as a full-grown adult in this like little baby body. What is, you'd think, well, what are you going to talk about? There's so much to talk about in terms of identity development and the perception of yourself versus how others see you. And so what I love about those episodes is oftentimes at the very end of the episodes, they're not like tightly fixed, or there's no like solution necessarily at the very end that says like everyone's going to be okay. And I think that in terms of the writing, we see that those endings that are either unresolved or that raises issues that make us think about things, or even make us kind of wrestle with our own feelings about depression or suicide or trauma. Those are the best episodes because it allows us to really kind of rediscover our identities and our psychology and our mental health.
Since we're sort of picking on Victor Fries a little bit, I would like to ask, for starters, and certainly it's not from the show, this is a character from comics way back when, but something I've noticed is Drea is a doctor, and she won't let me not call her doctor. But Victor goes from doctor to Mr. Freeze after the accident. Has he disconnected himself from the... It's not really a necessary question you have to answer, but...
The name, was largely the same, and I felt like he just sort of took that as sort of his criminal name, and gave up being the doctor, and then just, freeze and freeze. It's very similar, and he just played off the irony of it.
Because you created that origin story, I would love to hear your take on something that she and I have even talked about in regards to Heart of Ice and even Sub-Zero later, and especially Sub-Zero. Is Victor trapped inside of his trauma, or is he moving forward with the determination to help Nora?
I think one of the things that makes a villain, and I think this is partially behind Victor's psychosis, is not so much that he wants to join the world again. He wants the world to conform to what he is now. It's there's, as a lot of times different things will filter into my thought process, and with the snow globe, there were a few things I was thinking of at the time. I was thinking a little bit of Citizen Kane and about how he wants love on his terms because those are the only terms he recognizes, and I think that goes for a lot of the Batman villains. I was thinking a little bit of Ibsen's Doll's House, about somebody is kept basically in stasis. That's why I named his wife Nora, because it was sort of a nod to that, the way that Torvald only sees Nora in stasis in that thing. But not, it wasn't like I was trying to rewrite Ibsen. There were just little things that I felt kind of underscored what I was writing for me, and I just wove them in there.
Could you talk a little bit about for lack of a better term, the writer's room? Was there a writer's room in this particular animated series, or was it like sort of a lot of animated series today where you give some scripts to some writers and you let them develop? How much thought was there specifically in steering the development of these characters toward these types of origin stories?
In that case, it was my bedroom, because I was freelancing. I was home, and I was not working on staff at the time, but I would come in and talk to Alan, and I would just come into your office and shoot around some ideas sometimes.
There was no real writer's room. The writer would come in with ideas. Let's say we glommed onto one. There were several story editors, and we would beat out the story in my office usually. And Paul was sort of like, Paul would come in and he'd say, I want to do this story, one line. I said, fine. And he'd go back. I just trusted everything he did came out gold. So, but mostly we would discuss story points and where the accent and all that. But there was no big writer's room. The writer would go home and do his outline, bring it in. We'd have notes, then he'd go do his script. But the important part is getting it down in the beginning. I mean, the outline is everything.
Yeah.
It's everything.
My favorite part of the show's history is some of its groundbreaking decisions in the very early stages, especially in what's considered, I think it's called like Dark Deco, sort of the style, the coloring. But also, I think that in the very beginning, there were some challenges, or at least some edges you kind of wanted to approach, and maybe some lines you were considering crossing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think one of the things that was a bit problematic in starting off the show was establishing the right tone. And early on, the stories were going back and forth among several different writers and story editors, and the tone varied between kind of soft and very much good guy versus bad guy. And then we wanted to go, for the most part, a more complex way, and I think that's what really galvanized when Alan came on, because he saw characters like Clayface and Two-Face and as great allegories for the human condition, that you could do a real tragedy, Robin's Reckoning, stories like that really got to the heart of these characters. And that was a sea change from where the stories had been starting off going. And a few of them are, got through production, and they're not bad stories, but they're just not what the show would eventually become.
I tell you, one of the, I'm a meat and potatoes kind of guy, and one of the things that I had to have in Batman, and I hate guns personally, I will never have a gun, but I had to have guns and I had to have fights, or I wasn't going to do the show. I wrote about this in an article for the magazine here, but I wanted it just to be more adult, and I wanted it to have some kind of threat. to it. I wanted, our show was interesting in that it never ended on the commercial breaks never ended on cliffhangers. They ended on a situation that finally got resolved, but you got more information for the next attack. And in that way, it just started to feel more and more live action-y to us all. I don't know. I'm not answering the question, so I get lost in these questions. So.
What was really groundbreaking was that I think partially, to a smaller degree, we had so many episodes to do. We had to fill an order of 65, and then we got picked up for more episodes on top of that. So that to do a traditional episode that began and ended and featured Batman in every scene, those got harder to do, and those weren't really the goal. And once we established the characters, not only Alfred and Batgirl and Robin, but the ongoing villains, we would check in with the villains a couple of times a season and say, where is Poison Ivy now? Where is Harley? Where is Killer Croc? And they became part of the repertory. And recently somebody said, why did you never develop characters like the Cavalier or the Spook or the or Nocturna or a few of the other characters who were popular in the 80s that we could have easily expanded the Rogues Gallery? And I think the choice was we got to know the characters and we liked featuring them, and once we had our kind of core, maybe, 15 villains, we liked checking in with them. And not to say there's anything wrong with the Cavalier, but again, he's a fun character, but at the same time, I thought we got more out of Catwoman and Two-Face and those characters. They meant more to Batman ultimately.
So I'm wondering, when you say you wanted to check in with those characters again, was there an active decision to go back and look at where they had been and to move that story forward with them?
Sure. I mean, Catwoman is there were elements of romance all through the animated series and bits of a relationship that we had introduced, and we looked for ways to play that out throughout it. Certainly Joker and Harley and Ivy and just relationships between Batman, Batgirl, and Robin, keeping those relationships going.
You mentioned Catwoman, and it's one of those conversations that Dre and I have brought up before, and it actually helps answer the question that we had, because we noticed that Selina's never the same after Tiger. She's literally turned into a half woman, half cat figure, and up to that point, she had been this sympathetic, almost a vigilante as well. She was committing crimes, but for the sake of something, and she had this sort of banter with Batman and Selina with Bruce. But then after she recovered from that, she was almost a straight-up criminal, constantly just robbing banks or jewel heists or what have you. So it was one of those questions that we had about that was a very turning point moment for her. Clearly, you're not going to be okay after. It's no longer about the animals. So we were wondering about that.
That's interesting, because we had a talk. We were talking about making her more tough at that time. Like we had enough of their sort of flirtation going on. We put that going as, the sex life of Batman I find fascinating. I do. I think and this is a strange thing to say, but he is kind of the opposite of sex. He is. I mean, that's a crude way of saying it. There's nothing cuddly, there's nothing romantic about him. When I was talking with Denny O'Neil, both of us, Denny O'Neil said he's a celibate. He's a monk, and he can't afford feelings for women. And that's what, when I say he's the opposite of sex, that's what I mean. And I'm interested to know, in the comic books, what is the feeling about him and his sex life? I mean, is he still a monk?
I think there is a great diversity in the Batman group these days, and in the way that the character is allowed to be handled. When the last editorial shift took place, one of the mandates was that there was a Batman for everyone, and we were each empowered to interpret it as we saw fit under the editorial umbrella of DC and how they, I mean, you see it with Harley. You guys can, there are how many versions of Harley at play at any one time. So I could only speak to the version of Batman that we wrote, which is in a book for aimed at middle grade students. We kind of sidestep the romantic life, but we do hint at a past.
Yes, that's how we felt about him. There was time you just stopped him.
Yeah.
And
Was it around the time of Andrea?
Well, that actually it was before. It was after Andrea left. But when she came back, years had passed by, and I think that's he just stopped. He just stopped with women, and we've talked about this. Go ahead.
Well, I think he had to close the door to parts of his life in order to function as Batman, which is where I feel, or that he feels that he does the greater good and where his heart is. And I think that when when you open your heart to somebody in a very trusting way, they now have the means to really hurt you if they choose to. And I think one of the strongest lines we ever put in was in Mask of the Phantasm, and somebody could only say this when they know both sides of Batman's, who Batman is. And Andrea has this argument with Batman, says the only one in this room controlled by their parents is you.
Yeah.
And that goes right to the heart.
Yeah.
I love Paul. He gets very emotional.
I know.
Well,
but it does. I mean, that is like a wound that only an intimate person could give him, and somebody who's been through the same sort of thing. And I think I don't think he's a weak person by any stretch of the imagination, but that's the price that comes with letting somebody in.
But it does bring up the question. Drea's one of her very popular theories on Bruce is that he has 3 personas.
Loosely. He doesn't have multiple personality disorder or anything like that, or DID, which is the current multiple personality disorder. But he has, I think, kind of like a public persona, like Bruce Wayne is his public persona, and you'll see him with women. But that's superficial. That's my understanding, is that Bruce Wayne is the public persona. He goes through all the motions. He needs to make these appearances, and he wants people to think that he is somewhat of just maybe a bit unattainable, but also seen as this, ladies' man. And I think that, when you said he's the opposite of sex, my brain couldn't comprehend it because I now understand what you meant in that it's the intimacy that he can't tolerate. And so we'll see, actually in the animated series, we'll see moments where Harley will, playfully kiss him, or other female characters will get close to him physically, romantically, and there's a very deliberate expression on his face of intolerance and discomfort. And so I think that's what I understand is that the public persona is Bruce Wayne. He can pretend like he's okay with it. Batman is laser focused on being helpful and seeking threats and saving people, and he doesn't have time for the romantic stuff, right? And then Bruce, who maybe is the integrated self, is the guy who has difficulty with intimacy and feels uncomfortable when others want to learn more about him or get close to him, because that's what we do. We want it, all of us. That's just kind of our human nature, and I think even his reaction to that, I think a lot of us can also relate to that because we've been hurt before, we've been in pain. We know that to trust somebody else means that we are vulnerable, and I think that there's a lesson learned with his amount of distancing, because you might also argue that that's what keeps him isolated, that's what keeps him alone socially, and that's what makes what I would consider the most integrated persona, Bruce, at home, in the Batcave, or just by himself. that's the guy that we want to understand better, but that's the guy who's pushing people away.
And in the same, you and I have talked a number of times about, say, Christmas with the Joker, the second episode, where he's so uncomfortable just sitting down and watching It's a Wonderful Life with Dick. Like, we're not even talking about a romantic relationship. It's just, I'm not comfortable here. I need to put on the cape and cowl and go outside and beat somebody up. And he actually is looking to beat someone up. There's someone he believes is going to be a mugger, and it turns out that person is just returning some old lady's purse. But Batman's like ready to pounce. And Dick's like, told you, nobody does this on Christmas until they do.
So he's right all along.
Right. Well,
His instincts were correct.
Drea, you have a very you've got a very solid stance on Bruce. He's doing the best he can.
I agree with Brenden, right? We've multiple representations of Batman. When we're talking about the animated series, I do genuinely think that he's doing the best that he can with what he's working with. And you can see that he does make attempts to connect with others. Mm-hmm. He is willing to, especially with Robin, and with Batgirl later on, he's willing to kind of be a little bit closer to them. And then we realize that he has yet to reconcile his past, his history, his own personal trauma. And every day, that's what I think he's trying to do. I think he's trying to reconcile that. And I think every day he learns a new lesson about intimacy, about partnerships, about family, and certainly about real threat versus, I guess, perceived threat. And that distinction is something, honestly, that we're all dealing with right now. When I walk out that door, what is a real threat to me, to my person? My ability to walk around the gas lamp and not be harmed or harassed or hurt. We have those thoughts. Everyone has had that feeling before. Mm-hmm. And when is that feeling accurate, and when is that feeling perceived? More of a cognitive distortion, if you will, some idea I have, because my world is shaped by my experiences or what I see on the news or what I see in the media or the way that people have treated me before. So I think that these are the extensions of these lessons are incredibly important for us today.
I know a lot of people are going to want to talk about the rogues. I'm going to open up the room to questions, certainly, because I know a lot of people are like, oh, the Joker, or So if you guys want, you can. There's a mic here, but there is a question that. For starters, Paul, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit.
Sure.
Paul wrote an amazing book over the last year. It came out over the year, Eisner nominated, called Dark Knight: A True Batman Story. Who here's read it? If you haven't read it or don't own it, the first thing you need to do tomorrow morning is go onto the floor and pick up a copy, because it's an important book. I get touched, choked up thinking about it. But it's an autobiographical account of a real trauma that happened to you, Paul, and nearly left. Well, not nearly left for dead. And not only your physical but your emotional recovery, and the way that you portray that using Batman and the Rogues Gallery is absolutely heartbreaking, but also heartwarming by the end, and it's important. One thing that I've noticed in interviews that you gave about that, and we sort of talked about this a little bit.
Sure.
You talked about after that night, you didn't want to write for Batman anymore because you couldn't imagine him being there and doing these things. And I noticed that after your return, many of your stories, many of your best scripts involve the rogues reforming or trying to reform and maybe not being given the opportunity, or, and we always see Batman sort of like standing outside someone's window just being like, I know you're going to mess up, and one could think that maybe he's driving them to it. But I'm wondering if watching villains become more human was a response to that night.
Well, you go through a traumatic experience, and I think it makes you more thoughtful about perhaps the time you have left and how you've spent it, and the reality that it could all end very suddenly. And am I doing the most I can with my life? Am I telling the stories I want to tell? It takes you to, it certainly rams home the concept of violence, and it goes from being, the words pow, bam, flying up in front of the screen to actual physical pain and the process of recovery. So yeah, I think that definitely worked in there. Like I said, with Heart of Ice, the shadings for a lot of these stories come from different places. So I don't think there's any one particular example that I can point to, but I think that night made me a little more think a lot more about the consequences of violence. It made me a little more empathetic to the way I was living my life toward myself and to other people, and to value my life and other people in my life a little bit more once I'd gone through the initial process and it started truly into the healing process. I think it gave me a lot more to think about. A friend of mine said, as bad as that night was for you, I don't think you could be the person you are today. I think to some degree, your world might needed to have gotten shaken up and shattered a little bit so that you could put it back as somebody who was a little more willing to be outside in the world, maybe forced out of your comfort zone, and see if you could put something a little stronger back together. So yeah, so definitely that always seeps into the work.
So I want to open it up to questions. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Andrea. First of all, awesome idea. I only just learned about it from this panel of your podcast. I'm totally going to check it out. So I myself have mood-related issues I've dealt with, and I ended up getting a lot of help through mindfulness training. And just what I found is, looking back on all the years that I didn't have anything going for me to help with these problems, I needed some way to talk about it. And I've also noticed throughout the years, the public narrative is always, well, I'm not a professional, so I can't say anything about this or that. And it goes to this extreme where someone I'm very close to, I have to wonder, how is the conversation going to go when I need to mention to her, like, your father is clearly suffering from, like, paranoid schizophrenia, and that's why you and I instinctively and correctly know that he seems like he's on a path to being homeless for the rest of his life, and neither of us know what we can do about it. But my question is, how do we push forward with the public narrative to make it more possible to just openly talk about psychology and how we can all empathize with it?
Thank you so much for this question and for sharing a little bit about your story. I think this is probably one of the main reasons we keep doing this podcast. There's no reason why folks over here sitting in your seats can't know the things that I know. I feel like everybody deserves to have access to psychological education and access to interventions and effective treatments. And certainly, one of our aims with the podcast is to increase public knowledge about mental health illness. And when you look at how common mental health problems are, it's 1 in 4. 1 in 4 people at some point in their lives will struggle with some kind of mental health or substance use disorder issue. So we see this as like, this is all of us. There's really few exemptions to that. So one of the things that we try to do and that I encourage people to do is to talk openly with a non-judgmental approach and to often start with our own stories. I think that can kind of normalize things and allow people to see your authentic self. Just kind of how what you did was an excellent way to talk about a sensitive topic, right? And then you mentioned mindfulness. You mentioned reaching out for help. Asking for help is one of the hardest things that we can do. It's part of our culture is that if you ask for help, that means you're weak, or that means that you can't get better on your own, and so there's a lot of stigma around that. And so I think that the more that we demonstrate ways that we've helped ourselves and helped each other, that will facilitate other folks stepping forward and understanding or trying to reach out to better understand what's going on with their family, their relationships, etc. And then related to your story, I do want to say that we've had a lot of emails about certain diagnoses and certain situations. Harley and the Joker have actually brought up so many questions about intimate partner violence. The Joker has brought up a lot of questions about things that we've mentioned during some of the episodes, like bipolar disorder, antisocial personality disorder, schizophrenia. We haven't necessarily landed on those diagnoses necessarily for these characters, but we explore them, and that has allowed people to reach out and talk about, I think my mom might suffer from this, or I think, my family member might need help. So, what I can recommend is to talk openly and to ask questions to others who are close to you about their situation, and to not give up. Because honestly, the first couple of times that you may ask if someone's in pain or needing help, our reaction is like, oh no, I'm totally fine, I'm good. So it may take some persistence and some compassion and a little bit of self-disclosure. I think you have that. You've demonstrated that.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've only got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to get
I will
through as
try
many
to
questions
be
as
shorter
possible.
with my answers. I'm sorry.
God, Drea, it's like you talk on the podcast all the time.
Hi, so I think it was really fortunate to have the animated series in a time period where a lot of the kids shows are really mature, and that like you as a kid could watch and enjoy the action, but then when you grow up later, like you look back and like, wow, there are so many deep themes in the show. How do you think the Batman the animated series would have changed if it had been set today, where I feel like a lot of the kids shows are kind of a little more censored or a little more curated in that sense?
Well, I think we were lucky that the show came along. We were given the opportunity to make the show when we had it. I think that there was a bit more of a feeling of experimentation, a feeling of let's do this, let's take a few steps beyond where we normally are in terms of a show like this. And I think it brought out some interesting questions and made for some interesting characterizations. And it was, I don't necessarily see the same thing happening now. It seems to be more, this is a boy show, that's a girl show, and a boy will only sit through this because they've got so many options. That was another thing, is that you had the networks, and then you had a few syndicated shows, like in the afternoon, and now there are so many options for different types of entertainment, and entertainment is so fast and so omnipresent that you can look at a little cartoon on your phone, and then you can watch a whole half hour or everything. When you could only see Batman like 5 days out of the week, it meant a little bit more, and you were able to do more with it. Whereas now there are so many choices that one of the things I've heard, this was on a show I worked with some time back, don't approach stories like that. They'll confuse kids. A kid won't understand it if they're not watching the hero from the get-go till the last scene. Their attention span is like that, and they'll turn it off, and then we'll lose them. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but the people I was working with at the time did. So I think Batman sort of existed in a perfect storm. It was the right people making the right show at the right time.
I think we might have time for one more. So sorry, guys, but if you got to. No. Quickly.
All right, I feel like I need to make it really good then. Andrea, of the various kinds of interpretations of Batman that have existed and have been published and interpreted throughout the years, of the ones that you're most familiar with, which ones would you say are the most and the least psychologically damaged interpretations of the character?
Oh, wow. Okay, quickly. So just so I understand the question, which versions of Batman are on the healthier spectrum? side?
Exactly.
Okay.
Probably bad phrasing on my part. I apologize. But
No, I think it
Super
makes
Friends,
sense.
very healthy.
Honestly, again, the animated series I think is the most psychologically well-rounded, most dimensional version, where you have moments of healthy, successful kind of representations where you're like, yes, he's doing well, he's doing good, he's bonding with Dick or with Batgirl, with Barbara, or with Commissioner Gordon, and you
Simon
think
Trent.
Yeah, there you go.
and then there are times where you think he's doing terribly and he's burnt out, and you think, he might be so clinically depressed he's suicidal. So I think that this is the most well-rounded psychological version of him. I would say Frank Miller's version is certainly more extreme in terms of the psychological intensity. And then, to go live action, I think Adam West was a very healthy representation of this character. Yeah, I think that I certainly do. But I also want to quickly, I know we have to stop, I want to quickly mention, if you didn't get to ask your question, I see you. I know that you had a few things to ask. I will be around. I don't know if any of these fine gentlemen can stick around. I will be around. I'll be happy to answer them, and we'll have our contact information available.
Where can folks find you guys online? Or just in general, if they want to write for you fan mail or listen to your, I will say, Warner Archive just announced Batman: Mask of the Phantasm on Blu-ray, and I don't think there's a better Batman movie that exists.
Nope.
So you absolutely need to pick that up. But folks, where can?
I don't have a website. Maybe someday.
That's fair.
Bug me on Twitter. I'm there.
My name everywhere, at Brenden Fletcher on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr.
I'm Arkham Asylum Doc on Twitter and Instagram.
And you can follow the Arkham Sessions. We are at Arkham Sessions, and come subscribe to the podcast. There's so much we could talk about. We could do this annually, if you'll say yes. But thanks, guys, everyone, for coming, and enjoy the rest of your show.
Thank you for coming. It's really a lot of fun.